All right, let's be making our way in our Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 16. That is where we left off. I know it's been a while since we've talked about 2 Samuel, but again, this is where we left off the last time that we were able to talk about this again. I've been out for filling in for other preachers. I meant to get an update on Ken Burleson. I'm not exactly sure how he's doing. I hadn't checked with some of the members there, but continue to pray for him. You know, brain bleed is a very serious medical issue, and add to the fact that his wife also has had some health issues too recently. So just again, keep praying for them. Remember that in the book of 2 Samuel, that where we are at this point, David has basically lost control of the kingdom. Right, that happens as a result of who taking away his leadership. Absalom, right? And David, of course, as we saw in chapter 15, is basically on the run. He is not without some support, though, right? The priests, the Levites, several others that we read about in chapter 15 come to the aid of David. And one of those individuals in particular will play a prominent role in not just chapter 16, but especially when we get into chapter 17. David's on the run. He is no longer, in a lot of ways, accepted as the king of Israel. And while things are very bleak for David in chapter 16, things will, of course, get better as we move throughout the rest of the book of 2 Samuel. But we are going to pick up in verse 5. Remember that at this point in chapter 16, we are introduced again to Ziba, one of the servants of Mephibosheth, who comes and provides a lot of needed resources for David and his men to kind of, again, catch their breath, prepare themselves, be able to eat, something that in a time like this, you know, if you're on the run, you don't have a lot of your food source and things that you need to survive. You have to rely on others to provide that. And that's what happens in verses 1 through 4. Ziba comes through for David. Now in 16 and verse 5, we're introduced to a fellow that does not like David. And does not like David for several different reasons. Most notably, of course, dealing with this man's particular background, as we'll see. Now, something to keep in mind as we look forward in this chapter is the fact that sometimes we have to be careful about assuming the reasons why somebody in life may be suffering. Sometimes in life we come to the conclusion that people suffer because this is God's way of punishing them. They've done something extremely awful and wicked. God is punishing them, and things will never get better for that individual. And we have to be very careful of that. That'll come out into play tonight. Certainly we know that David is in part suffering because of his sins, right? And that goes back to chapter 12 where, again, Nathan the prophet told David, within your own household, the sword will devour one another. And that is what we've seen happen. And it will continue to happen. But in all of this, remember that God does not abandon David completely. Sometimes we get to the impression that when somebody's suffering in life, it's a sign that God no longer is concerned about that individual. That's not true, and that's especially not true when it comes to the example of David tonight. Whereas this individual we're introduced to in verse 5 thinks that everything's over for David. All right, so 2 Samuel 16, beginning in verse 5. Now when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, coming from there. He came out cursing continuously as he came. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. Also Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil because you are a bloodthirsty man. All right, so we're introduced to this man named Shimei. Now we know, of course, that they came from that this encounter happens when he comes to the city of Bahurim, which most seem to think that is a city that's located on the northern side of the Mount of Olives. Which, keep in mind, David has went from Jerusalem. He's moving east, basically towards the Jordan River, and one individual from this city that is very close to the path where David's traveling takes this opportunity to let David know about how mad he is towards David. Notice, of course, who is this man related to? He's related to Saul. Again, the city itself was more than likely located within the tribe of Benjamin. No doubt we've talked about at length that Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and we are specifically told that this man is from the house of Saul. Now, keep in mind, this individual has other reasons why he would be mad at David. Not just for what has happened in terms of Absalom taking over the kingdom, but naturally this individual who is the relative of Saul has a lot of beef with David. David, of course, was the king that came after Saul. You know, Saul and his kingdom did not flow through Jonathan. It did not flow through the house of Saul like what many in the house of Saul would have wanted. Instead, David became king. The house of Saul was cut off. Not only that, we know, of course, back in 1 Samuel, Saul and a lot of his family members, and that will also come out in 2 Samuel 21, Saul and a lot of his family members die. Saul, Jonathan in 1 Samuel. We know that Abner, Saul's most loyal commander, right underneath Saul, he dies at the hand of Joab. Another one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, remember that he also dies as well. And so when David becomes king, there is a lot of bad things that happen to the house of Saul. And in this man's mind, his point is that all these bad things that have happened to the house of Saul have happened because of King David. King David's the one responsible for it. So again, when you think about this overall point, you know, when we think about why do people suffer, sometimes people want to blame others for their suffering. And sometimes that might be true, but sometimes we suffer in life and we want to put off blame on somebody else because in reality we don't want to accept that we could have been the problem. And in this particular case, Shimei, who of course probably did not want to have to admit that his relatives, at least with Saul, was not a good king. You know, a lot of times you think about presidents, they will typically do that. It doesn't matter if they're a Republican or a Democrat, but you know, a lot of times when a president, especially if he's dealing with a problem early on in his presidency, he'll talk about how it was the fault of the president that came before him, right? They don't want to take responsibility because it makes them look bad. And perhaps that's what's going through with Shimei's mind, right? I don't want to have to admit that Saul wasn't a great king, and here's a great opportunity because David has lost the kingdom from his own son. And so he comes out, notice that he is coming out and he curses continuously as he came. Now, the idea here is not what we would think about in terms of swear words or things like that, but the idea of cursing in this sense would be the idea of pronouncing misfortune that would come upon David. In other words, Shimei is coming out, and obviously we see some of the statements that he makes, but he's also again saying that all these bad things are happening to David because it's all David's fault. Now, this verse is important because in Exodus 22 and verse 28, according to the law of Moses, a citizen of Israel could not curse their ruler. Certainly could not curse God. But if you look at Exodus 22, verse 28, and I'll just turn over there and read that briefly. Exodus 22, verse 28, you shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. Which, while David is on the run, I mean, in a sense, he technically is the ruler in a sense. And this was something that was forbidden by the law of Moses. You could not curse your ruler. You could not speak evil of him, at least in that sense, as what Shimei is doing here. And in this particular case, this certainly fits because Shimei is, again, putting a lot of blame on David. But as we're going to see, God does not leave David's side like he left Saul's side. Now notice in verse 6, not only is he cursing David, he's also throwing stones at David. Now, he does this, and notice that all the people, all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. It's not as though David's walking alone or he's riding on his donkey alone going through the city, but he's also got his bodyguard, his security detail team. They're right there with him as he's moving along. And it takes a lot of courage, or we might could say foolishness, to try to throw stones at the leader of a country when his security detail team is right there and can see you doing it. Right? I don't know if y'all remember this, but I do bring it up in my class from time to time. But you might remember, I think it was 2003, I believe it was, President George Bush was actually making a speech, and a member of, I believe it was an Iraqi journalist, took his shoes off and threw it at the president. I don't know if y'all remember seeing that on TV. But remember that when he started doing that, everybody rushed and tackled the guy, right? Because you don't do that towards a ruler of a country. Now the interesting thing about that is, I think the guy that did that is actually running for parliament in Iraq, which I don't know. I mean, Iraq doesn't really like the United States, so I guess that makes sense. But you never know with people. But the point is, this is something that you just don't do. It doesn't make sense to do this, for your own sake. But Shimei nevertheless does it, right? Come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom, your son. So now you are caught in your own evil because you are a bloodthirsty man. And Shimei's point is, David, you are suffering in life at this point because you took the kingdom by force. You had people like Saul, people like maybe Ishbosheth. In his mind, you had these people eliminated, you had these people killed, so that way you could rise up the ranks to become the king of Israel. And he might could point out to the fact that, David, don't forget, when Saul died, technically you were still serving in the army of the Philistines, which we know he did. David, after all, it was one of your men that had Abner killed, right? Joab had Abner killed. Joab was right underneath David. Some could say that, David had a hand in the death of all these men. And so in Shimei's mind, David, this is why you are suffering now, is because you were bloodthirsty. You wanted to do whatever it took, no matter the repercussions, no matter whether it was right or wrong. You were going to do whatever it took to become the head of Israel, no matter who you had to kill to get there. And so now, God is justly punishing you through your son, and that's why you are on the run. And again, that's where it ties in with this grand idea, right? We have to be careful about assuming why people suffer in life. We know, of course, because we've read through 1 Samuel and up to this point in 2 Samuel, we know for a fact that David was innocent in a lot of these accusations that's being made here. We know, of course, when it came to Saul, for instance, David, while he was serving with the Philistines, David, of course, was not allowed to go to the battle to help the Philistines out, right? He left. He was down in southern Judah while all that was taking place. David didn't have a hand in that. In fact, we know, of course, that what did David do to the man that bragged about killing Saul? Yeah, David had that guy killed instead for bragging about killing Saul. Remember that when Joab killed Abner, for instance, right? David had no knowledge of this. David did not order this. David was not a bloodthirsty man. He was not suffering because of what he had done to the house of Saul. Now, he was suffering in part because of his sin with Uriah and Bathsheba. But when it came to this charge, Shimei was not correct. David had not suffered because of what he had done to the house of Saul. And that is a very important thing for us to keep in mind. We have to be very careful we have to be very careful when it comes to not jumping to conclusions about why do people suffer in life. And a lot of times, when we see somebody suffering, we in our minds we think about some type of justification about why it's happening. Sometimes we might do that to make ourselves feel better. Sometimes we might do that as a way to try to help that individual out. But there is the principle about making sure that we have all of the facts before we make a serious accusation about why somebody suffers in life. Because sometimes we can be very wrong in that. When we are wrong, not only can we hurt the individual that's suffering, but we make ourselves look bad. And Shimei in this passage does not look like a very wise man at all, because we know that he's wrong. You might recall in John chapter 9 that the apostles were with Jesus and they see this man that was lame, he's not able to walk. And you remember what the apostles asked Jesus when they saw this man? Yeah, who committed the sin to where he's laying there and he can't get up and walk? Was it him? Was it his parents? Who was the one responsible for that? Well, Jesus, of course, said it wasn't his parents, nor was it him, but this is happening so that basically Jesus could fulfill Scripture. He could perform a miracle to heal this man. And you see the man's loyalty to Jesus throughout that chapter. So we have to be very careful about not jumping to conclusions about why somebody is suffering, because we can be wrong in our estimation if we don't have all the facts. Now notice that the reaction in verse 9 and verse 10. Notice the reaction of what David's men is to this accusation. Then Abishai the son of Zeruiah said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head." So naturally, David's nephew, right? Remember that Zeruiah is one of the sisters of David. Abishai would then be his nephew. He was, of course, part of his traveling company. Their response to this is, why don't we just go and kill this individual? Right? Notice again the phrase "dead dog" was a term of derision. It's a dog, of course, is an unclean animal. The emphasis of dead would not only be the emphasis of dead is not just the fact that something is dead and of little effect, but if you think about an animal that's dead, and a dead animal was also unclean. So in a way, it's kind of really emphasizing the idea of uncleanness. Not only is he a dog, but he's a dead dog. So it's like twice unclean. And that was a term of derision towards Shimei for this. Abishai's trying to get across the point. This is a worthless guy. He's no good at all. And so if this guy's worthless, Abishai's mind is, let's just go over there and cut his head off. Let's kill him. After all, Exodus 22, verse 28, you cannot curse the ruler of the people of Israel. Right? That was forbidden by the law of Moses. But here comes David along. And while David's not perfect, you do see a lot of wisdom in what David does, at least in terms of learning from his mistakes. Verse 10, "But the king said, 'What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?'" You could almost picture here that Abishai, and probably Joab too, because he was also a son of Zeruiah, you could almost picture in your minds their jaws dropping when they hear this. Because you would think David is absolutely enraged at Shimei, who's hurling all these accusations against him and throwing rocks and stones at him. You'd think David would be really mad at him, but instead David turns his anger towards Abishai. "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" Now notice the reasoning. "So let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David.' Who then shall say, why have you done so? Now, David's reasoning here is very clear. Perhaps it's the case that God has told him to curse David. And the reasoning why is because David has recognized, and we've seen this earlier since the death, at least since the death of David and Bathsheba's son, we've seen that David has recognized that he is suffering because of that sin. And that's what he's getting at here. Perhaps Shimei's actions here are a product of what God told him to do. Go and curse David. And if that is the case, who then shall say, why have you done so? If God told this man to go and curse me, then why are we going to punish him? Why are we going to ask him why is he doing this? Because he's doing what God told him to do. At least something that, in David's mind, something that David failed to do when it came to Uriah and Bathsheba. He is inflicting this because this is part of God's punishment towards me. And so that's the reasoning. That builds into verses 11 through 14, where again David addresses Abishai and the rest of the servants. Verse 11, David said to Abishai and all his servants, see how my son, who came from my own body, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? We can kind of see there the natural logic behind David's statement. If one of my own sons is wanting to take my own life, then why should we be surprised that one of the relatives of my former enemy is also looking to throw me down in the mud, to possibly even take my own life? This shouldn't come as a surprise to you. So let him alone and let him curse him, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. And David's response here is very important, and it says a lot about David. David's mindset is, if this is what God has ordered him to do, then let him go about doing it, because it's the result of my sin. And that sort of contrasts David and Saul. Saul did not want to have to accept the fact that he was being disciplined by God. Again, that's why he rebelled against God. That's why when he was, the day before he would wind up dying in battle, that's why Saul went to consult with the medium, the woman with familiar spirits at Endor. That's why he turned to idolatry. Because for Saul, he didn't want to have to accept the fact that he's being punished by God. He'd rather forget that that's happening by turning to other outside sources to take his mind away from that punishment. Again, sometimes in life, that happens to us as well. We suffer as the results of our sin, and rather than just accepting that, we are suffering, we'll get through this, and we'll learn from it, and we'll be obedient to God. Sometimes in life, when we suffer because of sin, that causes us to turn away completely from God. We, instead of repenting like what God wants, we start trying to find other things to occupy our mind to take away from that suffering. So, for instance, if I do something that causes shame on the church, instead of repenting and turning from that and then being restored, I may just say, well, I don't want to have to face, members of the church again, so I'll just stop going to church as a way to justify my mind where, I don't have to accept that I am being punished for my sins. David, on the other hand, notice that he has accepted it, right? If this is what God told Shimei to do, let him go ahead and do this. I am suffering for my sins. I have recognized that. And of course, we've seen David's grief. David, of course, was a man after God's own heart because he did repent of his sins. And so rather than just ignoring and trying to take his mind away from God's discipline, David accepts it. That's the big idea here. And if you accept the discipline of God, notice what he says in verse 12. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. The idea here being is that if David repents, then it could be that one day that God will turn away his wrath from David. Now we know that that happened a lot with the children of Israel, right? God would get angry with them, the people would repent, God would turn away his wrath. And you can think about other examples, right? God was ready to destroy the world in the days of Noah, but Noah found grace in the eyes of God. God provided a way for Noah and his family to be saved. Remember that Moses, when he came down from, you remember, I believe we talked about this a few weeks ago. You know, God saw that the people turned to idolatry while Moses was on Mount Sinai. God wanted to destroy the people. But Moses again pleaded on the behalf of the people. God turned away his wrath. That's what David's getting at here. If I repent, if I learn from my mistakes, if I'm obedient to God, maybe he will turn away his wrath from me. Now, to tie this in, look at Proverbs 24, verses 17 and 18. Dad, and I'm going to get you to read that for us. Proverbs 24, verses 17 and 18.
Rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it, and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him.
So notice what that proverb gets at, right? Don't be excited when your enemy falls. Don't take joy in the fact that he stumbles, because, verse 18, the Lord may see it, he may be displeased with your attitude, and then notice that he will turn away his wrath from him, from the one that stumbled and fell. Now, I think those two verses really do tie in here, because Shimei, who's rejoicing in David's fall, is going to have a very drastic change of heart in chapter 19, when all of a sudden things are going to be looking a lot better for David in chapter 19. And in that particular passage, Shimei is going to change his attitude very quickly towards David. He isn't going to be cursing and throwing stones at David, but he's going to come to try to get the grace and mercy of David. So when your enemy falls, don't rejoice in it, because if your enemy repents and is obedient like he should be, God's going to turn away his wrath from him. And that's David's point. Things could get better for me, which we will see that will be the case. So again, verse 13, David and his men went along the road. Shimei went along the hillside opposite him and cursed as he went, threw stones at him, and kicked up dust. So you can almost picture here as David and his men are moving, Shimei keeps walking alongside them, cursing and throwing stones and kicking up dust. And so verse 14, now the king and all the people who were with him became weary, so they refreshed themselves there. So in other words, they are weary, they have to stop, they have to sort of regroup, regather, and sort of catch their breath. Now, this verse is very important when we get to chapter 17, because the people at this point were weary. What that would indicate to us is that they are not really prepared to fight at this point. Now that fact becomes important because in chapter 17, Absalom's going to have to decide between the advice of Ahithophel and the advice of Hushai, the man that is secretly serving David. And they're basically going to give two options to Absalom. Either you attack them right now, or you take some time to prepare your troops. And Absalom's decision there, as we'll see in chapter 17, is going to be very critical to helping out David. And that is in part because in verse 14, they were tired at that point. They had to stop, catch their breath. They weren't ready to fight yet. And that verse 14, is going to come into play in chapter 17. All right, so with that being said, are there any thoughts or comments on what we've talked about up to this point?
You know, Shimei wasn't trying to kill David. I mean, if he had a bow and arrow and had to pull
Right.
back, or a sword or a club trying to beat him over the head, obviously they would have defended the king and taken action. He's just trying to humiliate the king, and he knows that. So that's one reason why he let him do it. We've got bigger issues than this nut kicking dust and throwing stones.
Right. You know who that makes me think of? Ernest T. Bass from the Andy Griffith Show, throwing rocks at people's windows. Yeah. He's kind of a nuisance more than he is an actual threat. Nevertheless, we do get at the point, right? Be careful about assuming why people suffer. Shimei was completely wrong in this. And David, while he does suffer, will not suffer for long. He won't suffer forever. And sometimes when we jump to conclusions about people suffering, we kind of expect them to be in that situation for the rest of their lives. That's not always the case.
Well, sometimes when we focus on what's happening bad to other people, we're forgetting the good that we should be doing.
Right.
And so it's hard to keep both on the forefront of your mind. So you just swing your mind to doing what's right.
Yeah, and you've got the natural comparison here, right? Ziba, when David's on the run, Ziba comes and is trying to help him out. At least what we gather from this chapter, right? He's providing provisions and things like that. Ziba's connected to the house of Saul as well. Shimei was connected to the house of Saul too, but his response, of course, was, don't help him out, humiliate him, and try to make yourself feel good by humiliating him. So that's a very good point, right? Again, it goes back to the fact that we don't rejoice when people suffer. We should not be like that. And this passage really illustrates that point. All right, we'll go ahead and begin looking at verse 15. Here we're switching pictures. We're moving back to Jerusalem. Now we're looking at the relationship between Absalom and Hushai, David's secretive informant. Verse 15, meanwhile, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. And so it was when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. And so Absalom said to Hushai, is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend? And Hushai said to Absalom, no, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so will I be in your presence. Now, Absalom is obviously aware of the relationship that David and Hushai have. Naturally, that's going to lead Absalom to a little bit of questioning. Naturally, he's going to be concerned about where is the loyalty of this man Hushai. You've been a friend for David for a long time. Why did you not go with him? Why are you coming to me and saying, long live the king, which was a statement of loyalty, basically, to Absalom? Why are you coming and making this statement when all your life you've been loyal to David, who was the king on the run? And we'll pick up with this a little bit more next week and talk about this a little bit more in detail. But Hushai's basic response is, I'm loyal to the man that's at the top. It's not as though I'm necessarily loyal to David, at least what he's telling Absalom. But if God and his people have chosen a man to lead Israel, that's who I'm going to be loyal to. Now, we know, of course, that God did not choose Absalom to lead Israel. But we're going to kind of talk about why a lot of people might think at that time Absalom was chosen by God to lead Israel. And that's going to be the impact of Ahithophel, who we'll talk more about next week. But if God put Absalom in this position, and this is who the people wanted, which we know, of course, that the people in chapter 15 liked Absalom a lot because of what he'd done. If this is the popular guy, this is who I am going to support. And thus I will be loyal to Israel in this way. And that we'll conclude on this point. But it's not always a good idea to back the individual that is the popular candidate, right? we can see a lot of problems with that. If a person's well liked, that can be a very good thing, but that doesn't mean that that person's in the right, or that person's perfect, or that person's not capable of making a mistake. Sometimes a person is popular because he's a good person, but there are other times where a person is popular because he's manipulative, because he makes bad promises, because he's not he's able to deceive a lot of people. And that's a good rule of thumb for us to keep in mind as well. When it comes to examining a person and whether a person's good or evil, certainly we do that in light of the Word of God. We certainly don't want to come to the conclusion that a person has got to be a good person because he's popular. Everybody likes him. Because that, of course, would not be true. It's not necessarily a true statement at all. Certainly we think about Jesus. A lot of people hated Jesus by the end of his life. A lot of people hated the apostles. They weren't very popular, but we know, of course, that they were good, righteous men. And that's something we could take away from this point. Just because a person's popular doesn't mean that we need to support that individual. There's more to take into consideration. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop here tonight. We're kind of out of time. We'll pick up, we'll probably go back over this section a little bit more Sunday morning, Lord willing, and then we'll finish out the rest of the chapter. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.